When we talk about Africa, her people, and her history, a lot of people unfortunately think about Africa, her people, and Africa's history from the perspective of the colonizers. But I saw this very amazing video where this brother addressed this topic from a very intellectually sound perspective, bringing into the conversation reason. Why were ancient Africans going about their lives like this? Why were they doing the things that they did the way they did them? So I thought I should share this video as well because a lot more people need to see what brother said in his video. That includes us African people, us black people as well, because let's not forget, unfortunately, a good number of us have bought into the lies of the colonizers. So now, unfortunately, we now look at not only ourselves, but our continent and our cultures from their perspective. We now view ourselves and our ancestors, their ways, and our continents from their lenses, which is very, very sad. But this brother did an amazing job in not only educating, but bringing into the conversation a very important perspective that would have you, looking back at everything differently if you have not gotten to that point already, like before now. So without further ado, let's the clip roll.
So during my undergrad, I took an anthropology class, and this one day our professor asked us a very interesting question. He said, "Why do you think Europe colonized Africa? Why didn't Africa colonize Europe?" And I remember thinking, that's a very interesting question. I don't know if I've ever thought about it in that very way before. And I remember thinking that I'm not sure if I know what the correct answer to this question is, but I feel as though I can probably figure out what some of the clearly wrong answers might be. And one of my classmates gave her answer. She suggested that, well, this is because there is something kind of inherently evil about Europeans. And I figured, all right, well, that's probably a clear example of a wrong answer to this question. I don't believe that any culture or any race has a monopoly on evil. But in class that day, I thought about the question for a little bit and I came up with an answer. I suggested that it probably happened because European nations had reasons to colonize and African nations did not. And part of the reason I thought this made sense was the fact that during my undergrad I also spent a decent amount of time studying modern European history. If I were to sum up modern European history in one sentence, I would say for the most part it was a phallus measuring contest between all of the countries in Europe. My modern European history professor would always say that European nations were constantly trying to keep the balance of power in check. They didn't want any other country to have a hegemony in the continent. And so in order to keep this balance of power, everyone was constantly at war with everybody else. And naturally, a lot of technological advancements happen in wartime. And so at some point, European nations realized that they could get more resources by doing colonialism, and so that became the measure of a giant phallus, having many colonies. And so in order to make sure that the balance of power remained as it was, and nobody was one-upping anybody else, they all went out to go get their colonies. And so as I thought back then, there are different reasons why colonialism happened. Some were fairly mundane, some were accidents of history, some just happened to be the geography of certain countries, some were intentional acts of malice and evil and racism on the parts of some Europeans. But there were all these different reasons. Now, why am I talking about this? That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. Because this comment is very interesting to me. And I'm particularly interested in what it means to say that all these other cultures were significantly more developed than Africa. What does significantly more developed mean? Who decides when something is developed? And what does it mean to say in a blanket sense that one culture is more developed than another? It is often remarked that when many Europeans first started interacting with Africans, their takeaways were that Africans had no religion, or Africans had no God, or Africans practiced some sort of paganism or animism. And it's often argued that this was as a result of a fundamental misunderstanding of how religions functioned in the African societies that Europeans interacted with. So let's say we're trying to determine what makes a culture more developed than another one, and we look in one place and we see a giant basilica or a cathedral that took hundreds of years to build and is a beautiful display of art and architecture. And this giant building is made as a place of worship to God. But in a different community, you can find their gods in small, very humble looking shrines. Now, it can be easy to declare that the first society is obviously more developed than the second one because one has a giant building for God, the other just has a very lowly looking shrine. But we can't come to this conclusion. Instead, we have to ask ourselves, what does God mean to these different people? And what are their reasons for building these places of worship? Cathedrals and basilicas are gorgeous pieces of architecture, and they are built to be so big in part because the idea is that you are meant to feel small in the presence of God. And they reach high up into the sky so they can reach God, who is up in the sky. But in many societies in Africa, this is not what God is. God is not this giant thing in the sky that is supposed to make you feel small. For example, in societies where people pray and worship their ancestors, ancestors were people who were once alive, that you buried in the ground, and now they are essentially like deities. So even if they are more powerful than you, even if they are bigger than you spiritually, they were people who you put in the ground. There is a reference to the ground. And so if your shrine is indistinguishable from a person's house, that is understandable, because your ancestors, when they were alive, lived in houses. And so for people groups who believe this about God, there is no reason to build cathedrals or basilicas. If you don't believe that your God needs this, then why build it? And of course, because there's a lot of diversity across the African continent, if you want to find a people group that thought that it would be important to build giant structures for cultural or religious reasons, you can find that as well. The most obvious example would be the pyramids. You find plenty in Egypt, you find even more in Sudan. But I think conversations like this need to be seen within the context of reasons.
We don't necessarily address these issues like that, like the why were we doing them, because we have been for a very long time be conditioned by the colonizers, their beliefs, their point of view. So nobody's asking the whys. Everybody's just going to the conclusions that the colonizers had come to, which was they were just doing it because they were barbaric. We did not get to hear from the people who were doing these things the why they did them though. A very good example would be ancient Africans used to walk around with less clothing. The colonizers came to the conclusion that they were doing that because they were backward, they were uncivilized. That was why they were walking around with less clothing. But if you look at the continent, one very simple reason, I don't know, our ancestors could have more reasons why they were doing that, but one very simple reason why our ancestors walked around with less clothing on the continent was because the continent is very hot. So why would these people have the need or feel the need or want to wear much clothing when it's hot here? A group of people coming from Europe where it's cold had needed to wear much clothing. These people are living in tropical climates. It's freaking hot. Why would they need to wear much clothing? And also, when you put into consideration the fact that in ancient African societies, the mindset that they had was very different from the mindset that we have today. For example, the hyper of people and things that we have going on today wasn't a thing back then. And that is why across the continent, if you look at ancient African traditional attires, pre-colonial traditional attires, you would find them to be very revealing. We had no reason for turtlenecks. We had no reason for suits. We had no reason for all of this. What we needed was this. Side note, this is a cultural attire of the Igbos, right? Which again is very funny to me because we hear people say things like, oh, you're African, you need to cover up. We bloody never covered up on this continent. So what are you talking about? Oh, you are exposing your stomach. You want to be like the Europeans. What does that even mean? The Europeans, this is how they used to dress. They were the ones who switched up. Now we originate crop top and mini skirts. Show me your stomach. Started in Africa. So not only was environmental factor a reason why ancient Africans did not need to wear much clothing, they also did not need to wear much clothing because I'm just going to say it, their societies were not as sick and as depraved as our present societies are. Hell, according to historians, there were no prisons in Africa before colonization, and Africans had houses that did not have doors. They used to sleep in their houses without doors. That tells us a lot about the kind of people that they were at the time. I swear, everything went to hell during colonization. When we talk about colonization and how those colonizers came with disease, we don't talk about enough the mental disease that they came with. According to well-documented history, it was when the colonizers came down here that women started becoming objects and they started getting overly. Sarah Batman, anybody? Her story is very popular and it tells us so much about just how sick the colonizers were. Like, African women had always had this body and they were living just fine for hundreds of thousands of years. But then the colonizers showed up and oh my days. They started raping African women. Hell, on this same internet that we are on, if you go on Google, if you know what to search for, you can find colonization pictures of colonizers touching African women inappropriately. They took pictures of all of this. See guys, I probably should make another video entirely for this topic we're talking about now, how the colonizers brought their sick mindsets to Africa and basically corrupted our population. But in conclusion to the point I'm making right now, if we can get ourselves to the point where we stop thinking from the perspective of the colonizers, then and only then would we come to realize as a people that truly Africa was Eden, the colonizer was the forbidden tree, and the colonizers' ideologies was the forbidden fruit. The second we ate from that bloody fruit, that was the moment everything went to shit on the continent.
You also see conversations like this somewhat come up when talking about art. For example, look at these two sculptures. It can be easy to determine that this one is primitive because this doesn't look like an actual person. And obviously this one is more advanced because it's more photorealistic. But once more, we need to talk about the reasons why these two things were created, and we need to talk about what beauty looks like in these different cultures. It makes sense to think that if a culture does not care about photorealism as a standard for beauty, then their artists, at least initially, will not make photorealistic pieces of art. I think that racism enters this conversation when people start to suggest that the reasons why Africans did not build cathedrals was because they simply could not. There's something about the state of being an African that stops you from thinking of something like a cathedral. And obviously this is false. This is a piece of bronze art from Yoruba land, and there are Yoruba artists today who do hyper-realistic paintings as good as anybody else. This becomes a problem when people try to exclude Africans from common humanity, because in the world of being human, the idea is that if a culture, if a people group have a reason to believe that they need to do something, they're probably going to do it. If they believe that they need to build a cathedral for their god, they're going to do it. If they believe that they need to build a pyramid for their people, they are going to do that as well. If they believe that their god just needs a simple shrine, that's what they're going to do too. And oftentimes when you approach these issues while thinking about the reasons why people do things, a lot of these structures tend to fall apart and you find the arbitrariness of everything. For example, as I mentioned, a lot of Europeans believe that Africans were practicing fetish religions. And a fetish priest is somebody who speaks to spirits on behalf of people. And when African people groups do this, it's considered pagan, it's considered animist, it's considered witchcraft. But the Greeks had an oracle at Delphi that told them the future. How is that any different? Part of this also came from some Europeans believing that there is a natural way to worship. And so standing still in a cathedral while men in robes walk up and down the aisles chanting things in Latin while waving around little thingies, having smoke fill the room, that makes perfect sense. But if people somewhere want to, for example, dance around a fire, that's ridiculous. That's the wrong way to worship, but again, according to who? And of course, when other cultures make pieces of art that are more abstract, that is seen as primitive, but when Picasso does it, it's seen as an act of genius. And so who decides the standard for beauty? Who decides what the right way to worship is? Who decides what it means for a culture to be developed? These are important questions, at least I think so. Now, the theory that I came up with during my undergrad as to why I think Europeans probably colonized Africa and it didn't happen the other way around is, well, something that I thought of. I don't know if it's actually true or if it makes sense. So the people who research these things for a living, let me know if this theory holds any water. But in either case, these are my thoughts. Also, there's something I forgot to say. I think one critique that can be brought against this video is that I'm acting as though we have no idea what development means. And as a Nigerian, yes, I am aware of the fact that we have bad roads. I'm aware of the fact that we do not have constant electricity. I'm aware of the fact that many people don't have access to clean running water. So that is a thing. However, that's not exactly what I'm addressing in this video. I think it's one thing to say that Nigeria, like many nations today, are not as developed as other ones. It's another thing to say that Africa, since the dawn of time, has been underdeveloped compared to everywhere else in the world. The first point deals with economics and development studies and post-colonial theory. The latter certainly deals with different things, but philosophy is one of them. Because the idea that Africa is by its nature an underdeveloped place is a philosophical one. See Hegel. Yes, this video addresses the idea that Africa has always been underdeveloped compared to everywhere else.
I just quickly wanted to bring this video to you guys because brother did share quite interesting points. Really makes you think if it's something that you haven't thought about already. This video it definitely made addressing them rate to desist in his comments and people who just like to go about perpetuating the mindset of Africans were not as smart, they could not do ish like other groups of people were able to. But of course, because there are some Africans who unfortunately have bought into the colonizers' mindsets, read too much his rhetoric and his history. There are Africans who also feel like, why couldn't our people do things like other people were doing these things, right? So, brother making this video, breaking it down the way he did, bringing into the conversation reason and asking us to bring, the perspective of reason to these conversations as well, really does change moving forward how we can have these conversations, because bringing into the conversation reasons, the why, go back and think from the perspective of the people who were alive at the time doing these things, we could have a lot more of a grand, concise, informative conversations on this topic. Let's stop having conversations like this from them folks' perspective and start having conversations from our perspective. I feel like some of these things, like I said earlier, a simple look at our environments could give us reasons. But because we are looking outside of ourselves all the time, unfortunately, we fail to see what is in front of us. The points that brother raised up are very, very intellectual points. But if we were being as down and true to ourselves as we are supposed to be, I feel like we could have already seen this. But because we have unfortunately been socialized to look outside of ourselves and constantly looking at what are they doing versus what are we doing, or what were they doing versus what were we doing, and what were they not doing versus what were we doing, we greatly miss out on the things that we have in front of us. It's this mindset of the grass is always greener on the other side. While you are focusing so much on this other person's grass, you are abandoning your grass. You should be watering your own grass so your grass can be green. But instead of it doing that, you are focused on the other person's grass. Not even putting into mind that that person just might have fake grass. People have fake grass, it's okay. It could be plastic grass. Let me say that again. It could be plastic grass. So, yeah, leave their grass, focus on your grass, take care of your grass. So let's stop looking at what other people have going versus what we have going or not have going. Let's focus on our ish and get our ish together and we'll be fine. That's all I want to say on the topic. I hope that we will be able to find a way to start looking back inwardly. Yeah, and let's also stop judging ourselves based on standards that aren't ours. Let's stop doing that. But let me know down below, guys, what your thoughts are. I'm going to leave it here. Thank you very much for watching. This is quite a long one. I don't know how long this one has become. How many minutes are they see for that place? Thank you, guys. I'll see you in the next one. I hope you found this video educative, informative. Yeah. Bye. Okay, enough. Stop.